There's a very specific kind of story that makes your chest tighten before anything even big happens. Not because somebody dies or because there's some wild twist, but because you're watching a person swallow disrespect for so long that you start feeling it in your own teeth. That's the energy running through The Loser Ex-Husband is the Great Savior, a 2026 drama that takes the most humiliating setup imaginable, sits in it, lets it sting, and then dares you to keep watching for the moment the mask finally comes off. And yeah, you're on Flick Flare, so you already know I live for that moment when a drama stops begging for approval and starts collecting receipts. If you end up liking the way I break this stuff down, consider subscribing. No pressure, just, it helps. Spoiler-wise, I'm going moderate here. I'm not going to do the annoying thing where I pretend the premise isn't the premise. We're going to talk about the major beats that are already baked into the setup. Sayan spending 3 years as a humiliated live-in husband to keep a promise, Sasi coldly casting him out, the divorce, him withdrawing protection, and then the public debut where he exposes the people who stole his credit and leaves Sasi's family sitting in bitter regret. What I'm not going to do is invent extra twists or pretend I know specifics past what we've actually got. But we are absolutely going to talk about why this particular arc hits so hard when it's done right, and where it can get a little too self-satisfied when it's done sloppy. Because let's be honest, the title alone is basically a dare. The Loser Ex-Husband is the Great Savior is not subtle. It is practically screaming, you will watch this man get treated like trash. And then you will clap when the world finally realizes what it had. It's wish fulfillment with a bruised jaw. It's the fantasy of being underestimated, of being the quiet person in the room that everyone dismisses, only to eventually step forward and make everybody feel the full weight of their disrespect. But the thing that surprised me is how much the premise hinges on that one word in the storyline: promise. Sayan isn't just enduring humiliation because he's secretly powerful and playing 4D chess. He's enduring it to keep a promise. That's a totally different emotional flavor than the standard hidden CEO tolerates abuse because it's funny trope. A promise suggests sincerity. A promise suggests a past. A promise suggests that at some point, he decided his own dignity was negotiable, and he did it anyway. And if you've ever been the person who stayed too long in something, relationship, job, family dynamic, because you gave your word, because you didn't want to be the one to break it, because you believed enduring was the same thing as being loyal, then this setup isn't just juicy, it's personal. Here's what the story gives us cleanly. Sayan is a hidden savior figure who spent 3 years as a live-in husband being humiliated. Cersei eventually casts him out coldly, which matters. Coldly tells you she isn't doing it in the heat of some misunderstanding. Not in a sobbing mess, not in a moment of chaos. It's controlled. It's calculated. Then he divorces her and withdraws all protection. And then, when he finally makes his public debut, he exposes those who stole his credit and leaves Cersei's family in bitter regret. That's the spine. And it's a sturdy spine. It's a clean reversal. It's the story taking everything that was private humiliation and turning it into public consequence. Now, before we get too high on the revenge fumes, I want to sit with the first half of that arc, the humiliation. Because this kind of drama lives or dies on whether it earns your anger. If it rushes the humiliation, the revenge feels cheap. If it wallows too hard, it becomes misery as entertainment. And you start resenting the show for making you watch suffering like it's a cute aesthetic. This is where The Loser Ex-Husband is the Great Savior makes a strong choice with that live-in husband detail. It's not just that he's an ex-husband in name later. It's that his humiliation is domestic. It's not a rival company snubbing him in a boardroom. It's the everyday space, home. It's the place where you're supposed to be safe. And the phrase live-in husband carries this weird implication that he's not fully belonging. Like he's a guest in a role that should be equal. And I don't know about you, but that's the kind of humiliation that feels quieter and sharper at the same time. It's not one dramatic slap. It's the constant sense that your presence is tolerated, not cherished. Let me paint you a mini scene the way the story feels in my head, because the emotional geometry of it is so vivid even without extra plot details. Imagine Cyan in a house that isn't really his. Not because he can't afford one, but because emotionally, the walls don't acknowledge him. The sound design in a drama like this always matters. Footsteps in a hallway that never come toward you. Doors closing with that soft finality that says you're not invited. The faint clink of dishes that you weren't asked to sit down for. Cyan's there, physically present, and somehow treated like a shadow. And the camera, if it's smart, doesn't glamorize it. It lingers just long enough for you to feel the embarrassment creep up your neck. And then it moves on like the world does, like the humiliation is normal. That's what makes the eventual reversal satisfying, not the power reveal by itself. The fact that for 3 years, power didn't protect him from disrespect inside that home. And this is where I'm going to drop a take that might sound contrarian, but I mean it respectfully. I don't automatically read Cersei as a one-note villain just because she coldly cast him out. Obviously, she's positioned as the person who wrongs him, and the story wants you to feel the brutality of her choice. But cold can mean a lot of things in dramas like this. Cold can be cruelty, yes. Cold can be entitlement. Cold can also be fear dressed up as control, especially in families where love is transactional and people learn early that warmth gets you exploited. Now, I'm not excusing her. I'm saying the most interesting version of this story is the one where Cersei's coldness doesn't come from cartoon evil, but from a worldview that has been rewarded her entire life. A worldview where Cyan's value only exists if it is visible, branded, and socially validated. And because he's hidden, because he's quiet, because he's keeping his promise in private, she reads him as worthless. That's not just villainy. That's a cultural sickness. If the drama leans into that, it stops being just girl bad, guy good, and becomes a critique of how people treat devotion like weakness and assume power must look loud to be real. There's also something kind of dangerous about the savior premise that I want to call out early. When Cyan withdraws all protection, the story is playing with a fantasy of consequence. And consequence is satisfying. But it can also slide into cruelty if the show isn't careful about who gets hurt and why. The cleanest revenge arcs don't just say, "You were mean, now suffer." They say, "You made a choice with incomplete information because you refused to see me as human, and now you have to live in the world you built." That's a moral difference. It changes the flavor from petty vengeance to tragic accountability. And you can feel the story trying to frame it that way because the key line isn't Cyan gets revenge. It's Cyan withdrew all protection. Protection implies he was actively holding something back. Harm, fallout, exposure. He wasn't just absent. He was shielding. That makes the betrayal hit differently. It suggests that even while he was being humiliated, he was still doing something for them. Okay, but the real catnip here is the public debut. That phrase alone has this ritual energy. It's not just that he becomes known. It's that he steps into visibility at a moment of his choosing. In these dramas, the public debut is never just a press conference. It's a stage. It's a declaration. It's the moment the private self and the public self collide, and everyone who misjudged him has to do the mental math in real time. If the production knows what it's doing, that scene isn't rushed. It's built like a drum roll. The soundscape gets cleaner. The edits get sharper. You feel the air change. And then the exposure lands, not just as information, but as humiliation boomeranging back to its source. And that's where those who stole his credit becomes such an important detail. This isn't only about a relationship. It's about theft. It's about authorship. It's about someone else wearing the results of his labor like a jacket and then sneering at him for being cold. Let me just admit something personal here, because it's shaping how I react to this story. I have a really hard time watching prolonged humiliation arcs. Not because they're poorly written by default, or because my nervous system does not enjoy being trapped in that second-hand embarrassment for extended periods. I'm the person who pauses a show and walks to the kitchen like I'm getting water, when really I'm just trying to shake off the feeling of watching someone be treated as less than. So for a drama like this to work for me, it has to make the pain meaningful. It has to feel like the story respects the character, even while other characters don't. And the promise angle helps. It frames Cyan's endurance as a choice he made for reasons bigger than ego. It doesn't make the humiliation okay, but it keeps him from feeling like a doormat for plot convenience. Now, there's a structural risk in stories like this that I want to dig into, because it's the thing that separates the addictive ones from the exhausting ones. The risk is that the show confuses humiliated with passive. Those aren't the same. A character can be humiliated while still being internally active, observing, deciding, holding boundaries quietly, choosing restraint strategically. If Cyan is written as internally active, his eventual reveal feels like the culmination of agency. If he's written as a blank sponge who just absorbs abuse until the plot says go, then the reveal feels like flipping a switch, not like a person breaking through. And with the way the storyline is phrased, to keep a promise, Hidden Savior Cyan spent 3 years as a humiliated live-in husband. I actually think the intent is to show active restraint. To keep a promise is motivation. It implies he had the option to leave, the option to fight back, the option to expose people sooner. He didn't. That makes his later decision to divorce and withdraw protection feel like the moment the promise expires, not the moment he randomly grows a spine. That's way more satisfying emotionally because it means he wasn't weak. He was committed. And commitment has limits. If you want to get really nerdy about it, this kind of arc is basically a pressure cooker story. You lock the protagonist into a constrained environment where they're forced to compress themselves, and the audience starts craving release. The release can't just be loud. It has to be precise. It has to hit the right targets. The storytelling craft is in how it escalates tension without turning the protagonist into a punching bag for entertainment. And look, I'm not going to pretend I'm above the appeal here. Watching someone expose credit thieves after years of being dismissed is delicious. It's the narrative version of finally finding the email thread that proves you weren't crazy. It's that moment when somebody tries to rewrite history and you calmly open the folder labeled receipts. But there's a line between satisfying and smug. The best version of this drama keeps Cyan human. It lets him be angry, yes, but also hurt. It doesn't turn him into a flawless revenge machine. Because the most interesting emotional question in the storyline isn't, will he expose them? He does. The storyline tells us he does. The interesting question is what it costs him to finally stop protecting people who never protected him. And that's where Cersei's family becomes important. The bitter regret isn't just about Cersei as an individual. It's about an entire family system that benefited from Cyan's hidden protection while simultaneously humiliating him. Regret in this context isn't just we miss you. It's we were wrong about the kind of world we thought we were living in. Here's another rehook for you. What if the real twist isn't that Cyan is powerful, but that he's the only one in the story who understands the difference between power and dignity? Because that's what this premise is really chewing on. Cyan has power, sure. Protection implies resources, influence, skill, or status. But dignity is what gets stripped from him. And dignity is what he has to reclaim. The drama's emotional engine is not the reveal of his status. It's the reclaiming of self-respect. That's why the divorce matters so much. Divorce in these revenge setups isn't just a legal break. It's symbolic. It's the moment he stops agreeing to be defined by how they treat him. And I want to linger on the word divorced instead of left. He divorced her suggests formality. It suggests finality. It suggests he's not sneaking away in the night. He's not sulking. He's making it official. That's a different kind of strength than storming out dramatically. It's measured. It's cold in its own way. And that mirror between Cersei's cold casting out and Sion's cold formal severing? That's good drama symmetry. Now, when we talk about acting in a drama like this, there are two performances that matter more than anything: Sion's restraint and Cersei's certainty. The actor playing Sion has to sell humiliation without playing it as pathetic. That's a narrow, tricky lane. Too small, and he disappears. Too big, and he becomes melodrama. The best choice is usually micro-behavior: a jaw that tightens and then relaxes, a glance that stops itself, the way someone takes a breath before answering because they're swallowing something bitter. And for Cersei, the performance has to be convincing in the worst way. She has to believe she's right. If she's written and played as obviously wrong from the jump, then the later regret feels fake, like the story is punishing her for being a designated villain. But if she's played as someone who thinks she's making a reasonable call, someone who's accustomed to being rewarded for decisiveness, then when reality turns and she realizes what she did, it lands like a punch. Visually, these dramas often do a really effective thing with status cues. When Sion is in his humiliated live-in husband era, the framing tends to make him feel slightly out of place. He's present, but he's not centered. He's in the edge of shots. People talk over him. The environment feels like it belongs to everyone else. Then, when he makes his public debut, the show flips that grammar. He's centered. The lighting respects him. The cuts linger when he speaks. And even if you don't consciously notice that shift, your body does. You feel it as relief. Music and sound design can either elevate this premise or flatten it. If the drama leans too hard into triumphant music too early, it steals tension. You don't want to feel like the show is cheering while Sion is still being degraded. That creates tonal whiplash. The better approach is restraint. Let the early stretch breathe with quieter, almost oppressive soundscapes. Let the satisfaction come later when it's earned, and then let the score swell just enough to feel like catharsis, not like propaganda. And yes, I'm fully aware I just used the word propaganda about a revenge romance drama. I contain multitudes. Also, I say that as someone who loves these shows. I just like when they respect my intelligence and don't tell me what to feel every 10 seconds. Now, can we talk about the emotional psychology of stolen credit for a second? Because that detail makes this feel less like a simple relationship revenge story and more like a story about identity theft, socially, professionally, morally. When someone steals your credit, they don't just take recognition. They take your narrative. They get to be the hero in the room while you're treated like deadweight. So when Sion exposes those people publicly, it's not just gotcha. It's him reclaiming authorship. It's him saying, no, that was me. And if you've ever been in a situation where someone took your work, or your idea, or your emotional labor, and then acted like you were replaceable, that exposure is more than satisfying. It's healing in fantasy form. But here's the part that can get thorny. When a drama is built around public exposure, it has to decide what it believes about shame. Does it believe shame is justice? Or does it believe shame is a tool that can be used for justice, but also can corrupt? That's a thematic fork in the road. If the show treats public humiliation as inherently righteous, it can get mean-spirited fast. If it treats exposure as a necessary correction, and then allows space for complex aftermath, regret, grief, accountability, then it becomes more than a revenge snack. And since the storyline ends with bitter regret, I'm hopeful the show leans into that aftermath feeling, at least emotionally. Regret is a quieter emotion than panic. It suggests the family sits with what they did, not just scrambles to fix optics. There's also something incredibly telling about Sion withdrawing protection rather than actively attacking. That's a form of revenge that isn't about doing harm. It's about stopping the labor of shielding. In other words, he's not necessarily creating new consequences, he's letting existing consequences finally reach the people who kept dodging them. That is such a clean metaphor for what happens in relationships when one person is always buffering reality for the other. You cover their mistakes. You soften their rough edges to other people. You handle problems quietly. You make sure the bills are paid emotionally, even if the other person doesn't see the cost. And then one day you stop. And suddenly they're like, why is the world so harsh? Babe, the world was always harsh. You just had someone quietly holding an umbrella over your head. That dynamic is catnip for drama writers because it gives you a moral high ground without having to make the protagonist cruel. Cyan doesn't need to become vindictive. He just needs to become absent. And absence, when someone depended on you, is devastating. Okay, but let's not pretend that his 3-year endurance doesn't raise questions. This is where some viewers are going to bounce off, and I get it. 3 years is a long time. It can strain believability if the show doesn't convincingly portray why he stayed. The promise has to feel heavy enough to justify the cost. Otherwise, the audience starts thinking, I'm sorry, but at some point this is self-inflicted. And I want to be careful here because I think that reaction can come from a good place, wanting a character to protect himself. But it can also flatten the reality of what promises mean in certain moral frameworks, or what staying means when you're entangled in a family system. Or when leaving isn't just leaving a person, it's breaking a vow that anchors your identity. If the show is smart, it doesn't treat Cyan staying as romantic. It treats it as tragic. It shows it as a slow erosion of self, even if he believes he's doing the right thing. And that's where my own values come in, because I'm going to be honest. I don't find suffering silently admirable by default. I find it heartbreaking. It can be noble, sure, but it can also be learned helplessness dressed up as loyalty. So I'm always watching to see whether the drama interrogates that or just fetishizes it. And that's another reason I don't want to reduce Cersei to a mustache-twirling villain. If Cyan is written as someone who chooses suffering because of a promise, the story becomes more complex if Cersei is also shaped by a promise-like pressure, family expectations, status performance, the demand to appear strong. To people trapped in roles is more interesting than one saint and one monster. Now, do I think this drama is trying to redeem Cersei? The storyline doesn't say that. It just says she and her family end in bitter regret. Regret isn't redemption. Regret is pain. Regret can be the beginning of change, or it can be the punishment itself. And for the viewers who are here purely for the catharsis of watching her lose, listen, I'm not judging you. I have popcorn too. I just think the best version of the story gives you satisfaction and also leaves you with an aftertaste that makes you think. Because the thing about regret is it doesn't bring time back. It doesn't undo the 3 years. It doesn't unhumiliate somebody. It just makes the people who caused harm finally feel the shape of it. Here's a question I kept turning over while sitting with this premise. What does Cyan actually want once he's free? Not what the plot wants. Not what the revenge fantasy promises. What does he, as a person, want after 3 years of shrinking himself to fit a promise? Does he even know? That's the emotional landmine these stories sometimes step on, because once the reveal happens, sometimes the protagonist becomes a symbol rather than a human. The show starts using him as a justice delivery system instead of exploring the weird emptiness that can follow liberation. If the drama takes even a little time to show that emotional disorientation, who am I when I'm not protecting people who hurt me? Then we are in business. That's where the long-form satisfaction lies. And speaking of long-form satisfaction, I want to highlight something about momentum. This storyline is basically two major movements, endurance and reversal. The endurance part has to create investment without numbing you. The reversal part has to pay off without turning into a repetitive parade off, and then he owned them again. The sweet spot is variation. The sweet spot is escalation that changes shape, not just volume. A lot of dramas in this lane will mistake escalation for loudness. More yelling, more slaps, more dramatic confrontations. But a truly satisfying reversal doesn't need constant fireworks. Sometimes the most brutal moment is a calm sentence spoken in public with perfect timing when everyone else realizes the room has shifted. And public debut gives the show a stage to do that. Debut implies ceremony. Ceremony implies witnesses. Witnesses are everything in a story about stolen credit. Because credit theft is social. It's not just about facts. It's about who believes the facts. So the exposure isn't just Cyan telling the truth. It's Cyan controlling the audience of the truth. That's power. Now, let's talk about the title again, because I think it's doing more than being goofy. Loser ex-husband is the label society puts on him. Great savior is what he actually is. The story is literally about the violence of labels. About how easily people accept a narrative when it flatters them. If Cersei's family benefits from Cyan's protection, it flatters them to believe they deserve it. It flatters them to believe Cyan is lucky to be there. So they label him as a loser to keep the world stable. When he withdraws protection, he destabilizes the label system. Suddenly their self-image can't stand on its own legs. There's also an interesting implication in hidden savior. Hidden means deliberately concealed. It means he isn't just misunderstood. He is intentionally not taking credit. That's a moral choice, but it's also a strategic one. It suggests he knows the value of invisibility. And that's where the drama can get really tasty in terms of subtext. Invisibility as protection, invisibility as punishment, invisibility as control. Because when you're invisible, people show you who they are. They don't perform for you. They dismiss you. They tell on themselves. And Cyan, if he's written with any sharpness, has spent 3 years watching. There's a kind of quiet horror in that, honestly. The idea of sitting in a home, in a marriage, watching the people around you reveal their contempt in tiny ways, day after day, while you hold the secret that you could change everything if you wanted to. That's not just humiliating. That's isolating. And isolation is where the actor playing Cyan can really make or break it. Because you need to feel his loneliness without needing constant monologues. You need to feel that he's not just biding time. He's enduring emotional starvation. Okay, quick self-aware aside before we go deeper, because if I don't say it now, it'll sit in my throat. The name Cersei automatically makes my brain want to hear dramatic strings and someone sipping wine while plotting. That's not the drama's fault. That's just my pop culture contamination. I'm trying to be normal about it. Now, one of the most interesting choices the storyline gives us is that the moment Cersei casts him out is what triggers the divorce and the withdrawal of protection. In other words, she initiates the rupture. That matters. It means Cyan doesn't leave because he gets bored of playing house. He leaves because the other person makes the choice to discard him. That makes the later regret sharper, because it's not just we didn't appreciate you. It's we actively rejected you. It's the difference between neglect and expulsion. And in terms of relationship dynamics, that's a devastating thing to watch, because it hits at one of the most primal fears in love, not being enough, and being thrown away for it. Even if Cyan is secretly powerful, the emotional wound is still real. Power doesn't prevent rejection from hurting. This is why I always roll my eyes a little when people dismiss these dramas as pure power fantasy. Yes, there's power fantasy here. Absolutely. But the emotional fantasy underneath it is not I'm rich and everyone bows. It's I'm worthy, and the people who treated me like I wasn't will finally have to admit it. And that's honestly relatable in a way that feels a bit embarrassing to admit on camera. But whatever, we're friends here. I think most of us have some version of that wound. Maybe not in marriage form, but in friendship, in family, in work, in being the person who carries things quietly and then gets treated like background noise. So when a story is built around credit theft and regret, it taps into that ache. It becomes less about money and more about recognition as love. Here's another pivot that I think is worth paying attention to as you watch. Does the drama treat Cyan's protection as love or as obligation? Because those are very different. If protection is love, then withdrawing it is heartbreak. It's a severing. If protection is obligation, then withdrawing it is liberation. The storyline frames it as something he did to keep a promise, which leans obligation. But obligation can still be loving, and that ambiguity is where the drama can get emotional mileage. If he protected them because he truly cared, then the divorce is not just a mic drop. It's grief. If he protected them purely out of duty, then the divorce is a righteous ending to a contract. Both are compelling, but they create very different aftershocks. And speaking of aftershocks, public debut implies that Cyan is stepping into a new social identity. There's always a cost to that. Being hidden means you can control what people know. Being public means you become a symbol whether you like it or not. If the drama has any interest in complexity, it might explore how visibility can be its own kind of trap. I'm not saying it definitely does. I'm saying the premise opens that door, and I'm hoping the writing has the courage to walk through it. Because the easiest version of this story is just a line of dominoes. Humiliation, expulsion, divorce, protection withdrawn, exposure, regret, clean, efficient, satisfying. The better version is messy in the right places. It allows people to be contradictory. It allows Cyan to feel things he doesn't want to feel. It allows Cersei to experience regret that doesn't automatically turn into redemption. It allows the family to confront not just we were wrong about him, but we are the kind of people who could do that to someone. And that last part is the real mirror. That's the part that makes a drama linger after you finish watching, because it stops being about one couple and starts being about a moral ecosystem. There's a reason the storyline specifically says exposed those who stole his credit and not just proved himself. Exposure is outward facing. It's social. It's public shame as a corrective force. And public shame is a loaded weapon. It can be deserved. It can also be addictive, both for the character wielding it and for the audience consuming it. So the question becomes, does the drama want you to enjoy the humiliation of the wrongdoers more than it wants you to understand the humanity of the protagonist? If it's the first, the show becomes candy. If it's the second, it becomes catharsis. And I want to sit in that tension for a while, because it's not just a writing thing, it's a viewer thing. When we cheer for public exposure, what are we cheering for? Justice? Truth? Punishment? Vindication? I'm not asking that to be preachy. I'm asking because this genre is basically built to poke that part of our brains that wants the world to be fair retroactively. And there's something both comforting and unsettling about that. Now, let's talk about the pacing of emotional payoff, because it's the hardest thing to get right in an arc like this. The storyline's biggest set pieces, emotionally, are Cersei casting him out and Cyan's public debut. Those are the two big hinges. The scenes between them, the divorce, the protection withdrawal, need to feel like a gathering storm, not like a quick montage. If the show rushes from cast out to public debut, it loses the delicious middle, the moment where Cyan decides who he's going to be now. That's where the character arc lives. That's where the performance can do the heavy lifting. And I'll tell you what I always look for in that middle section. Not swagger. Stillness. A lot of dramas think the moment a hidden savior decides to reveal himself, he should immediately become icy and untouchable. But real emotional strength often looks quieter. It looks like someone finally sleeping peacefully. It looks like someone eating a meal without dread. It looks like someone making a decision without asking permission. If the show gives Cyan those moments, those small human recalibrations, then the later exposure becomes more than revenge. It becomes transformation. And this is where, again, I'm not going to invent specifics, but I can talk about the kind of editing rhythm that supports that transformation. You want the early humiliations to be cut in a way that feels slightly suffocating, shorter beats, less space, the sense that time is happening to him. Then, as he pulls away and chooses himself, you widen the beats. You give him time. You let silence land. You let the viewer feel, oh, he's not trapped anymore. And when you finally hit the public debut, you tighten again, but in a different way. Not suffocation, precision. The cuts become clean, confident. The sound becomes crisp. The camera becomes intentional. The world aligns around him because he's aligned within himself. That kind of craft language is what separates a bingeable drama from a forgettable one. It's not just what happens. It's how the show makes you feel time. Let's zoom back out to Cersei's family. Because family in bitter regret is a strong endpoint for a group dynamic. It implies there were multiple people benefiting from Sion's hidden role. It implies there were multiple people participating in his humiliation, directly or indirectly. And it also implies that Cersei herself is not acting alone. She is part of a collective. That matters for how you interpret her coldness. Sometimes coldness is personal cruelty. Sometimes it's a family's emotional weather system. You grow up in a house where warmth is weakness, and you learn to speak in decisions instead of feelings. You learn to discard before you can be discarded. You learn to treat people as roles. Again, not excusing, explaining, because understanding the machinery makes the downfall more meaningful. If the family is in bitter regret, it means their machinery failed them. And I think that's why this premise has such strong legs. It's not just romance. It's social commentary dressed up in a revenge suit. It's about what happens when people confuse quietness with insignificance. Here's a little promise I'll make to you as we keep going through this drama's choices. I'm not just here to chant Sion deserved better. He did. Obviously. That's not interesting. The interesting part is what better actually means once he gets it, and whether the story understands that vindication is not the same thing as healing. Because I've seen too many dramas in this lane treat exposure like therapy. Like, if you just embarrass the people who hurt you in front of the right crowd, you'll finally feel whole. And sometimes you do feel whole. For about 10 minutes. Then you realize you still have to live with the memory of being small in that house for 3 years. So if the loser ex-husband is the great savior has any emotional maturity, it will let Sion's victory be real and still let his scars exist. It will let him be triumphant and still be affected. And the reason I'm harping on this now is because the premise is so ripe for flattening. The title practically invites flattening. It wants to turn him into a great savior statue and turn her into bitter regret on legs. But the story has the ingredients to be richer than that. And that's what I want to dig into next. The way humiliation can become identity, the way promises can become cages, and the way a public debut can be less about revenge and more about finally choosing to be seen on your own terms, even when being seen is the last thing that ever kept you safe. Even when being seen is the last thing that ever kept you safe, because that's the paradox at the heart of Sion's whole situation. He's a hidden savior, which means invisibility was not an accident, it was a method. And methods can turn into habits. Habits can turn into identity. So when the story pivots toward that public debut, the tension isn't only, now you'll all be sorry. The tension is, can he even stand there without flinching? The funniest part is that revenge stories pretend the hard part is the reveal, when the hard part is actually the emotional posture you need to carry once you've been exposed to disrespect for years. When people have spent 3 years treating you like you're disposable, you internalize this little instinct to make yourself smaller before they do it for you. You start pre-editing your own presence. So a drama that's worth its salt has to show, at least in texture, that Sion's transformation isn't just about status. It's about unlearning shrinkage. And that's where the promise really becomes the narrative pressure point. Because I can already hear the audience argument in the comments. Half the people are going to say, he's an idiot for staying, and the other half are going to say, he's loyal, he's noble, and the truth is it can be both. And that's what makes it interesting. A promise can be a moral anchor, and it can be a self-built cage. The real question is whether the drama understands the difference between loyalty and self-erasure. Let's rehook this right here, because it's the kind of thing you might not notice until it's already happening. Pay attention to whether the story treats Sion's silence as strength or as avoidance. Those two look identical on the surface, but they feel completely different in the gut. Silence as strength means he's choosing his moment. Silence as avoidance means he's terrified of conflict, terrified of being seen as bad, terrified of losing the one thing he's clinging to, this promise that lets him believe his suffering has meaning. And if it's avoidance, then the divorce and protection withdrawal aren't just a victory lap. They're a psychological breaking point. Now, the storyline tells us Cersei casts him out coldly. That is, structurally, the inciting incident for the reversal. The way a drama frames that coldness tells you what it thinks about power in relationships. Coldness in these stories is often depicted as someone who's above you, someone who can decide your fate without emotion. But coldness can also be a shield for someone who's trying not to feel guilt. If I don't feel, I don't have to be responsible. That's why a cold breakup can be more devastating than an angry one. Anger at least acknowledges you mattered enough to provoke emotion. Coldness says you were never real to me. If the actor playing Cersei understands that, she doesn't need to scream. She doesn't need a dramatic villain monologue. She just needs to look through him like he's furniture. And if the camera is brave, it will hold on Sion's face for half a second too long. Long enough for you to see him process that he's not being rejected as a partner, he's being deleted as a person. I'm going to stay careful here and not pretend I know the exact scene, but I want to talk about what a moment like that feels like when it's filmed well. The room doesn't have to change. The set can be neutral. The lighting can be normal. And yet the temperature drops because of blocking. Cersei is standing in a position that implies ownership, near the center, near the doorway, near the decision-making space, while Sion is physically placed in the part of the frame where you put someone you're dismissing. Maybe he's slightly lower. Maybe he's at an angle. Maybe something in the environment cuts him off. A door frame, a wall edge, a piece of furniture. Those are subtle choices, but they communicate hierarchy without dialogue. Then you add sound. In a cold cast-out scene, the most brutal sound is often not music. It's a mundane sound continuing like nothing matters. A clock ticking, distant traffic, someone upstairs laughing faintly. Life continuing, the world not stopping. That's what makes humiliation feel real. Your pain is private, but the world stays casual. And if Sion is written with restraint, he doesn't collapse. He doesn't beg. He does something way harder. He absorbs it, not because he should, but because that's what he's trained himself to do. And that sets up the divorce as a kind of retraining, a reassertion of boundaries. Now, divorce in this storyline isn't presented as mutual. It's his action after her expulsion. That's important, because there's a version of this story where Sion still tries to protect her even after she throws him out. And that would be infuriating, frankly. There's a thin line between noble and spineless, and a lot of dramas love walking it until the audience is screaming at the screen. Here, the storyline says he divorces her and withdraws all protection. That's decisive. That's clarity. That's the story saying, no, he's not staying in the role of the martyr forever. And I respect that. I really do. But I also want to poke at something. The phrase withdrew all protection implies the protection was comprehensive. Not just emotional support. Not just a quiet favor. All protection. That suggests he was holding up a lot of the structure around them. And when someone is holding up the structure, everyone else gets lazy. They start believing the structure is natural. They start thinking the roof is strong because they deserve a strong roof. So when he withdraws protection, there's a delicious inevitability to the fallout. It's not he ruined them. It's he stopped preventing them from being ruined. And the morality of that is actually pretty fascinating. Because on paper, withdrawing protection is passive. He's not actively attacking. He's not setting traps. He's not sabotaging. He's simply stepping away. But in a family system that's grown dependent on your shielding, your absence feels like an attack. That is such a real-life dynamic, it's almost uncomfortable. People will accuse you of changing when you finally set a boundary. They will call you cruel for no longer doing what they felt entitled to. And that's the tragedy. You can't win. If you keep protecting them, you lose yourself. If you stop, you're suddenly the bad guy. So if the drama wants to be emotionally honest, it should let Cyan be seen as bad by some characters when he withdraws. Not because he is, but because that's what happens when you remove a crutch from people who thought it was a right. Here's a little turning point question that keeps me hooked in stories like this. When Cyan pulls away, does he feel relief first or grief first? Because either answer tells you what that promise really was. Relief first means the promise became suffocating, maybe even resentful. Grief first means part of him genuinely loved them, or at least loved what he thought he was building, and the divorce is still a loss. And yes, you can have both. Humans are annoying like that. You can be relieved and devastated simultaneously. And that emotional contradiction is where the best acting lives. Speaking of acting, because I keep circling it, and there's a reason, this story is basically an actor's playground if the cast is good. The script gives you a tight emotional arc, swallowed pride, calculated endurance, sudden expulsion, boundary setting, and then the public reveal with an exposure that reorders everyone's perception. That requires control. It requires the ability to play small without being empty. A strong Cyan performance would make you feel that he's always thinking, always choosing, even when he's silent. His eyes would do the work. The way he listens would do the work. The way he stands slightly too still when he's being humiliated, like he's holding himself in place, would tell you he's constantly managing the urge to react. And then, when he finally steps into public visibility, the shift should be almost frightening in its simplicity. Not a personality transplant. Not suddenly becoming a different man. It should be the same man, just no longer folded. That's the nuance I crave in these revenge dramas. Not a glow-up that feels like a costume change, but an unfolding that feels inevitable. Now, the credit theft angle is where the plot becomes more than domestic drama. Expose those who stole his credit implies a wider social arena. It implies there are people beyond the marriage who have been benefiting from his hidden work. And credit theft is one of those sins that instantly makes an audience side with the protagonist because it hits a universal nerve. You don't have to be a billionaire to know what it feels like for someone to take what you did and act like it was theirs. But the show has to make that exposure feel earned and specific without relying on contrived convenience. Since I can't confirm any particular incidents, I'm going to talk about the general craft challenge. Exposure scenes often become boring if they're just information dumps. Here is the proof, here is the evidence. Now everyone gasps. That's functional, but not emotional. The best exposure scenes are built around timing and humiliation dynamics. Who is watching matters. Who is forced to nod along matters. The moment of realization matters. The silence after the revelation matters. It's not just about truth. It's about the social consequence of truth landing in front of the wrong audience for the wrong people. If the drama nails that, the public debut becomes a spectacle without becoming cheesy. And yes, cheesy is a risk here. The title is already one eyebrow raise away from parody. So the show has to walk a tightrope. It has to deliver the fantasy, but keep the emotional tone grounded enough that you're not laughing at moments that are supposed to hit. Quick rehook. The moment Cyan withdraws all protection is where you find out whether the drama understands power as responsibility or power as leverage. Because if Cyan's protection was moral responsibility, something he did because he believed it was right, then withdrawing it is a heavy decision. It's him deciding he no longer owes them that moral labor. If protection was leverage, something he held over them, then the story becomes more cynical. It becomes a chess game. Both can be entertaining, but they send totally different messages about love, duty, and power. And I'm going to be transparent. I personally prefer the version where Cyan is responsible but not self-sacrificing, where he has a moral center, but he also knows when to stop bleeding for people who wouldn't hand him a bandage. Now let's talk about Sasi's regret, because that's where a lot of these stories either become emotionally satisfying or emotionally empty. Bitter regret is a strong phrase. Bitterness is not the same as sadness. Bitterness implies resentment mixed into the remorse. It implies that even as she regrets, there are part of her that's angry. At herself, at him, at fate, at the embarrassment, at the loss of comfort. And that is so much more realistic than pure, clean regret. A clean regret arc is often written like this. Wrongdoer realizes they were wrong, feels sorry, begs forgiveness, becomes better. That's neat, but it's not how people usually process being wrong in a way that threatens their identity. People get defensive. People get bitter. People rationalize. People flip between apology and self-pity. People regret the outcome more than the action at first. So if Cersei and her family are in bitter regret, I actually think that's an opportunity for the drama to be honest about how accountability feels when it's forced by consequence rather than chosen by conscience. And again, not to redeem her prematurely, but to complicate her. Regret is painful. If the show gives her regret but refuses her pity, that can create a very interesting emotional balance. Because as viewers, we might enjoy the comeuppance, but we might also feel that weird ache when we see someone realize too late that they destroyed something valuable. That's the kind of ache that makes a drama linger. Now, one of the things I want to highlight, especially for newcomers to this kind of story, is how much these revenge arcs are secretly about class and status performance, even when the script doesn't say class out loud. The loser label is social. It's a status verdict. It's a way of policing who counts. So when Sion shows up publicly as the great savior, what's being reversed is not just personal perception, but social hierarchy. And that's why the public debut matters. It's not a private apology scene. It's not a quiet reconciliation. It's him stepping into the arena where status is assigned and saying, "You assigned me wrong." That is a power move, yes, but it's also a demand for recognition in the language the world understands. And that's where it becomes bittersweet. Because ideally, people should have valued him privately, at home, without needing a public stamp. The fact that he has to go public to be seen is a condemnation of the people around him. Here's another thing that's quietly devastating. The storyline says he spent 3 years as a humiliated live-in husband. 3 years is long enough for habits to calcify. It's long enough for a person to start believing the humiliation is normal. It's long enough for the family to build routines around his invisibility. So when he leaves, it's not just emotional fallout. It's logistical. It's the daily structure collapsing. That's why withdrew all protection hits so hard. Because protection is often invisible labor. People only notice it when it stops. And invisibility is the theme that keeps echoing. He was hidden. His labor was hidden. His protection was hidden. His credit was stolen because it was hidden. The humiliation was possible because he was treated like background. Then the public debut turns invisibility into spotlight. That's a satisfying reversal. But it's also a commentary on how society punishes quiet competence. If you don't perform your worth loudly, people will assign your worth to someone else. Now, here's where I want to get a little critical, because I don't want to just gush about the premise. There's a genre trap that the loser ex-husband is the great savior could fall into. And it's this. The show might use humiliation as a shortcut for emotional investment. Like, look how bad he's treated, therefore you care. But caring is not automatic. Caring comes from specificity and humanity. You don't just need to see that Sion is humiliated. You need to see what it does to him. Does it make him numb? Does it make him hypervigilant? Does it make him overly controlled? Does it make him quietly resentful? Does it make him self-blaming? Those are different emotional colors. And those colors determine what kind of person he becomes after the divorce. If the drama doesn't give those inner consequences, then the exposure later is just plot candy. Fun, but not nourishing. And I'll tell you what, I'm always watching for whether a drama like this gives the protagonist a private breakdown, not a public meltdown. A private moment where he's alone and the mask slips. Because if the show never lets Sion be vulnerable, It risks turning him into a revenge robot. And that's boring. But if it lets him be vulnerable in private and controlled in public, then you get that delicious duality. Strength that is earned, not posed. Here's a rehook that I think is going to matter as we keep unpacking this. The most dangerous part of science arc isn't the humiliation. It's the temptation to become cold in the exact same way Cersei was cold to him. Because that's the thing revenge stories love to flirt with. When you reclaim power, do you use it to restore balance? Or do you use it to punish? Do you become what hurt you? And given that Cersei coldly casts him out, and Sion then makes a public debut and exposes people, the story is playing with coldness as a weapon. The question is whether it interrogates that weapon or just celebrates it. I'm going to be honest with you. I love a good cold, controlled mic drop scene. I do. It's cinema. But I also think there are a hollow version of that fantasy, where the protagonist wins by becoming emotionally unreachable, and the story frames that as healing. It's not healing. It's armor. Sometimes armor is necessary. Sometimes armor is a prison. So I want to see whether Sion's withdrawal of protection is paired with the building of new relationships, new trust, new warmth, or whether the story is satisfied with him being untouchable and adored. Now, because we are working from a tight storyline, I can't talk about supporting characters with certainty, but I can talk about the implied ecosystem. If people stole Sion's credit, that means there were opportunists. There were beneficiaries. There were enablers. And if Cersei's family ends in regret, that means there were family members who either actively humiliated him or passively allowed it. This is where ensemble acting can elevate the whole piece. You want distinct flavors of complicity. One person might be openly contemptuous. Another might be politely dismissive. Another might be nice but never stands up for him. Another might treat him like staff. Those are all different, and they all create different kinds of regret later. And regret itself can be played in different ways. Some people regret because they miss the benefits. Some regret because they miss the person. Some regret because they're ashamed. Some regret because their social standing took a hit. If the show is thoughtful, it will differentiate those regrets. Because not all regret is equal, and not all regret deserves forgiveness. And I'm going to say something that might annoy the revenge-only crowd. I actually think it's more satisfying when the wrongdoer's regret is not punished with immediate forgiveness, but also not punished with endless sadism. The sweetest justice is often letting them sit in the truth, and not giving them the comfort of closure. That's why bitter regret is such a good phrase. It implies a lack of closure. It implies they're stuck chewing on it. And sometimes that's the only fitting ending for people who treated someone like a disposable tool. Now, let's talk about the public debut again, but from a filmmaking perspective. Debut scenes are where directors can get indulgent in a good way. They can use slow motion, but please, sparingly. They can use a change in color grading. They can use a shift in camera height to make a character feel taller. They can use costume and styling as narrative. The trick is not to turn it into a music video. Unless you want it to be a music video, in which case, commit. But given the emotional seriousness implied by humiliated and bitter regret, I think the better approach is a restrained grandeur. Not flash, but wait. Imagine it. The first time the public sees Sion in his true capacity, the camera doesn't need to spin around him like he's a superhero. It can just hold steady while the room recalibrates. The tension is in other people's faces. The tension is in the tiny delay before applause, the whisper that dies mid-sentence, the way a confident person suddenly stops smiling because they're trying to rescan their memory for every cruel thing they ever said to him. That's the kind of scene that makes you lean forward. And it's also where sound design can do something delicious, reduce the ambient noise so you can hear a swallow, a breath, the faint rustle of clothing. The room becomes a pressure chamber. And then when the exposure lands, when he reveals the credit theft, the sound can come back in a rush, like reality flooding back. Okay, confession time, because I promised I'd be emotionally present, and I'm not going to fake being above it. The credit theft angle always hits me in a very specific way. I've had moments in my own life, nothing dramatic, nothing lawsuit level, where you watch someone else take ownership of something you poured yourself into, and you realize how powerless you feel when the room already decided who the real person is. When the room likes them more, or they're louder, or they fit the image better. And you sit there thinking, if I speak up, I look petty. If I stay quiet, I disappear. So when a drama gives the protagonist a public platform to correct that narrative, there's this involuntary relief I feel. Not because I want people destroyed, because I want truth to matter. And maybe that's why I'm so picky about how these shows handle it. Because if the exposure is framed as cruelty, it can sow the catharsis. But if it's framed as correction, it feels like the world briefly works the way it should. Here's a rehook for you that cuts straight into the emotional meat. The most heartbreaking part of Cersei's regret isn't realizing Sion was valuable. It's realizing she trained herself not to see value unless it benefited her image. That's the kind of regret that stings. Because it's not just, I lost him. It's, I became someone who could lose him and still sleep at night. And for the family, it's, we created an environment where cruelty felt normal. If the drama leans into that, it becomes a critique of a certain kind of social climbing culture where empathy is treated like a luxury and people are evaluated like assets. Now, let's shift to the romance dynamic specifically, because even if this is a broader revenge story, it's still anchored in a marriage that collapses. The storyline doesn't give us the origin of the relationship, and I'm not going to invent it, but we can talk about what the collapse implies about their emotional contract. A marriage where one partner is a humiliated live-in husband is not a marriage of equals. It's a marriage where one person holds social power and the other holds hidden functional power. And that imbalance creates a weird tension. The person with social power thinks they're superior, while the person with hidden functional power knows they're doing the real work. But the hidden person is not allowed to claim that work because claiming it would break the promise or reveal the truth. So the relationship becomes a theater. Cersei performs superiority, Sion performs compliance, and the audience, her family, society, whoever, applauds the performance because it matches their biases. And then the divorce is the curtain drop. What I would want, emotionally, is for the drama to show that this wasn't just a bad relationship, it was a relationship built on misrecognition. Not misunderstanding, misrecognition. A failure to recognize the other person's humanity accurately. That's deeper than we had communication issues. That's you didn't see me, and I let you not see me because I thought I had to. That's tragic. That's also, in a way, a little self-incriminating for Sion, and that's why the promise is so important. The promise gives him a reason for allowing misrecognition to continue. But it also raises a hard question. When you hide yourself to keep a promise, are you also stealing the other person's chance to choose you honestly? Again, not to blame him for being mistreated. The blame for humiliation belongs to the humiliator. But in adult relationships, concealment changes consent. If Cersei believed he was a loser because he was hidden, then part of her cruelty is ignorance. And part of the tragedy is that Sion's secrecy allowed that ignorance to metastasize. That is not a defense of her. It's an exploration of the messiness. And I'm saying this because I think the most compelling version of Sion isn't a flawless angel. It's a person who made a morally complex choice, stay hidden, endure, protect, thinking it was righteous, only to realize it enabled a culture of disrespect. That realization would make the divorce not just a reaction to being cast out, but a reckoning with his own complicity in his invisibility. Now, do I know the drama goes that deep? No. But the premise has room, and when a show has room, I like to hold it accountable for not wasting it. Let's talk about the theme of protection a little more, because it's doing heavy lifting here. Protection, in stories, can be romanticized. The savior protects the beloved. The beloved is grateful. Everyone cries. But in real life, protection can become control, and it can become dependency, and it can become entitlement. If Sion was protecting Cersei's family for 3 years, and they responded with humiliation, that means they did not perceive the protection as a gift. They perceived it as background, like oxygen. And when people perceive your gifts as oxygen, they don't thank you. They get angry when you stop breathing for them. So the drama's moral spine will be revealed in how it frames their reaction to his withdrawal. Does it frame them as victims of his abandonment or as perpetrators facing the consequences of entitlement? And that's not just writing. That's also editing. If the show cuts to sad music when the family suffers after he withdraws, it risks inviting misplaced sympathy. But if it keeps the tone more neutral or even slightly stark, it emphasizes accountability. There's also the question of whether the drama wants you to fantasize about being Sion or empathize with being Sion. Fantasize means you want the power and the applause. Empathize means you feel the loneliness and the humiliation and the weird grief of detaching. The best dramas do both. They give you the fantasy while grounding it in emotional truth. But some shows lean so hard into fantasy that they forget the character is a person. They turn him into a delivery vehicle for look at them regret. And that's when I start checking out. Here's a subtle craft thing that can keep the character human. Show the cost of public debut. Not just the triumph. The cost. Public debut means he's no longer protected by anonymity. People will project onto him. Enemies will notice him. Opportunists will approach him. And emotionally, he has to hold the weight of being seen after being unseen. That's not always comfortable. Sometimes being seen feels like standing under a microscope. If the show acknowledges that, even briefly, it adds maturity. Now, let's circle back to that contrarian take I started earlier. Cersei not necessarily being one note, and the pen it without getting soft. The storyline's phrasing is very clear that she wrongs him. She casts him out coldly. The family regrets. The story is not neutral. But I think there's a version of Cersei that's deeply believable. Someone who's been trained to respect only visible power and visible achievement, and who interprets Sion's humility as incompetence. In her world, being a loser is not a temporary state, it's a moral failing. She might not even think she's being cruel. She might think she's being realistic. That's the scariest kind of cruelty that thinks it's just truth. If the actor leans into that, Cersei becomes a portrait of a social attitude rather than just a villain. And that makes the regret more potent because it's not just personal. It's ideological collapse. But again, the story must not excuse her. It must show that ideological collapse hurts. It must show that people like that don't suddenly become kind because they got embarrassed. They might learn. They might not. But regret is not the same as growth. And I'll go one step further, because I think it's a useful lens. Cersei's coldness might be the same protection strategy as Sion's hiding, just expressed differently. He protects by being invisible. She protects by being untouchable. Both are armor. One armor looks humble. One armor looks arrogant. That's an interesting parallel. It doesn't make them equal morally, but it does make their dynamics psychologically rich. Rehook me with this. If both of them are protecting themselves in opposite ways, then the tragedy isn't just that she didn't see him. It's that neither of them knew how to be safe and seen at the same time. Now let's zoom into the emotional rhythm of the divorce moment, because again, we can't confirm the specifics, but we can talk about what the divorce represents in the grammar of melodrama. Divorce is one of the rare actions in Roman storytelling that is both ending and beginning. It ends the social contract. It begins the true plot. And in a show like this, the divorce should feel like a release of pressure rather than a spike of drama. If it's written with maturity, it's not about yelling. It's about clarity. It's about Sion naming reality. It's about him no longer negotiating with someone else's contempt. I love when dramas let a divorce scene be quiet. Not passive. Quiet. Because quiet can be terrifying when someone has been depending on your compliance. Quiet says, This isn't a fight. This is a decision. And you can do so much with a quiet scene. The camera can stay still. The score can be absent. The dialogue can be minimal. The power is in what isn't asked for anymore. No more pleading. No more explaining. No more trying to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. That's the kind of scene that makes me sit back and go, oh, it's done. Now, when he withdraws protection, the story basically sets up a domino effect. Again, not inventing events, just acknowledging the structure. Withdrawal implies consequences start arriving. This is where the show's pacing needs to be careful. It can't just do consequence after consequence like a checklist. It has to pick consequences that reflect the moral themes. If the theme is entitlement, then consequences should attack entitlement. If the theme is stolen credit, then consequences should expose false narratives. If the theme is invisibility, then consequences should force recognition. And ideally, consequences aren't random. They're poetic. Not in a corny way, in a thematic way. The consequence should feel like the world correcting itself. But here's the trap. Sometimes these dramas make the wrongdoers too stupid. They make them cartoonishly arrogant so the audience can laugh. And that can be fun, but it reduces the satisfaction. Because if they're idiots, exposing them isn't impressive. It's just inevitable. The best villains, or antagonists, or wrongdoers, however you want to frame them, have competence. They're socially smart. They're manipulative. They're skilled at maintaining their image. That's why they got away with stealing credit. That's why they could humiliate him for years without social backlash. So when Cyan exposes them, it should feel like he outplayed people who are good at playing. That's what makes the reveal thrilling. And yes, I'm basically begging for intelligence in the antagonists. This is my eternal struggle as a viewer. Please let people be smart. Please. I'm tired of watching characters trip over their own ego like it's a banana peel. Now, because the storyline says public debut, I want to talk about the camera's relationship to public space versus private space. In the early stretch, the home is likely the main arena of humiliation. In the later stretch, public arenas become the stage for reversal. That shift can be visually communicated through lens choice, lighting, and even color palette. Private humiliation often looks warm but oppressive, soft lighting that feels suffocating because it's false comfort. Public power often looks cool and sharp, clean lines, bright lights, reflective surfaces. If the show uses that contrast, it can make the reversal feel like stepping out of a claustrophobic room into a wide, cold world. But again, coldness can be a double-edged sword. A wide, cold world can be freedom, and it can be loneliness. So if the show is emotionally smart, it doesn't pretend public recognition automatically fills the hole left by private rejection. Here's a point that might sound like I'm overthinking, but I swear it matters. When Cyan exposes the credit thieves, the story is not just saying truth wins. It's saying narratives can be corrected. That's a powerful idea. It's also an optimistic one. Because in real life, sometimes you expose the truth and people still don't care. Sometimes the room is too invested in the lie. So when a drama gives you a world where exposure leads to regret, it's offering a comforting moral universe. A universe where accountability exists. That's part of why this genre is addictive. It gives you a fairness that reality often refuses. But the show has to earn that fairness by making the truth compelling enough that the room would actually flip. That comes down to writing and performance. The exposure can't be flimsy. The social stakes have to be credible. Otherwise it becomes fairy tale. And you know what? Fairy tale is not automatically bad. Some people watch these dramas specifically for fairy tale justice. But the loser ex-husband is the great savior is flirting with something heavier because it emphasizes humiliation and bitter regret, not just they were shocked. Bitter regret implies emotional weight. So I'm going to hold it to a higher standard. Let's rehook again because we're getting deep into the weeds. The best revenge stories aren't about revenge. They're about the moment the protagonist stops needing permission to exist. That's what I want from Cyan. Not just a mic drop. An internal shift. A moment where he realizes, I don't have to be understood by you to be real. Now, one of the most potentially powerful themes here is promise-keeping as identity. People who keep promises often tie their self-worth to it. They think, if I break my word, I'm nothing. So they endure things that harm them because the alternative feels like moral death. If Cyan is that kind of person, then the divorce isn't just leaving Cersei. It's risking his self-concept. It's him saying, I can keep my promise and still leave. Or, I kept it as long as it was mine to keep, and now it's over. That's huge. That's growth. And it's also where a drama can make a surprisingly mature point. Loyalty is not an excuse for self-abuse. I want that line tattooed on the forehead of half the romance protagonists in television history. Now, because we're on a review channel and not just doing a therapy session with fictional characters, let's talk about the storytelling structure again, but with a little more sharpness. The storyline suggests a clean arc: endurance, expulsion, divorce, withdrawal, debut, exposure, regret. The challenge is that the story could feel too linear, like a conveyor belt. The way you avoid that is by adding internal conflict and moral complexity. By making each step feel like a choice with consequences rather than a plot requirement. For example, when he divorces her, does he hesitate? Does he mourn? Does he feel guilty for withdrawing protection because he knows other people will get hurt? Does he consider whether protecting them has been harming them by enabling their entitlement? Those questions make the divorce a character moment, not just a plot step. When he withdraws protection, does he do it cleanly or does he struggle with the habit of caretaking? That struggle, if shown, makes him human. When he makes his public debut, does he enjoy the attention or does he tolerate it? Does he feel vindicated or hollow? That nuance makes him real. And for Cersei, regret can be written as a slow poison rather than a sudden realization. Bitter regret is often delayed. It creeps in. It hits when you're alone. It hits when you reach for something you used to take for granted and it's gone. If the drama captures that creeping quality, it'll land. Now, I want to address something that's kind of elephant in the room about this premise. The great savior trope can accidentally imply that a person's value is validated only through extraordinary power. Like, Cyan matters because he's a savior. He matters because he can protect. He matters because he can expose. But what about Cyan the person? What about his value before the reveal? This is where I think the drama has an opportunity to either reinforce a toxic idea or critique it. The toxic idea is, if you're not secretly powerful, you deserve disrespect. The critique is, even if you're powerful, you still deserve respect. And the fact that you only got it after revealing power is the indictment. The storyline's emphasis on stolen credit suggests the show might be critiquing the system rather than endorsing it. Because credit theft is a symptom of a society that rewards image over substance. So I want the drama to make it clear that the tragedy is not that they didn't know he was the savior. The tragedy is that they needed him to be a savior to treat him like a human being. That's a subtle but important difference. And it's where the writing can feel either shallow or sharp. Let's do another mini-scene retelling, not because I'm inventing plot, but because I want to capture the emotional sensation that this storyline promises. Picture the public debut in a large, bright space. You can hear the low murmur of a crowd, the kind of sound that's half curiosity, half judgment. People are dressed well, the lighting is unforgiving, and the atmosphere is performative. Then Cyan appears, not with a dramatic entrance, just present. And the sound shifts. It's like someone turned down the room by 5%. A few heads tilt. Someone recognizes him, but can't place him because their memory filed him under irrelevant. You can almost see the mental folders opening and slamming shut. And then the exposure happens. Not shouted, not theatrical. Clean, calm. The kind of truth that doesn't need to be loud. The best part isn't the words. It's the faces of the people who stole his credit when they realize their borrowed identity is being peeled off in public. Their eyes dart. Their throat bobs. Their posture collapses by a fraction. That is cinema. That is consequence as body language. If the drama delivers even a fraction of that feeling, it's doing its job. Now, a lightly humorous aside, because I need to breathe. If you've ever watched a drama like this and found yourself practicing your own imaginary public debut speech in the shower, you're not alone. I'm not saying I do that. I'm saying the algorithm can't prove anything. Back to it. The relationship dynamic between Cyan and Cersei is likely the emotional core, but the family regret suggests the drama is also about collective accountability. Families in these stories often act like a chorus. They reinforce the wrong perception until it becomes truth. They validate Cersei's coldness. They normalize Cyan's humiliation. So when Cyan withdraws protection, it's not just Cersei's worldview that collapses, it's the family's. And I love stories where family regret is not just emotional but existential. Where they realize they built their security on someone they treated like dirt. That's not just sad. That's humiliating in a different way. That's the humiliation of being revealed as ungrateful, incompetent, and morally small. But again, the show has to avoid turning that into a cartoon. If the family suddenly becomes a pack of groveling fools, it cheapens the arc. Regret should look like denial first. It should look like bargaining. It should look like anger. It should look like quiet dread. Only then should it turn into bitter acceptance. That progression is what makes it believable. Here's a rehook that also functions as a warning. The moment Cyan exposes the credit theft, the drama has to decide whether it's interested in justice or just dopamine. Because dopamine is easy. Justice is harder. Justice requires that the exposure has meaning beyond embarrassment. It requires that Cyan's life actually changes, not just his status. It requires that the wrongdoer's regret leads to an internal confrontation, not just external loss. I'm going to keep returning to this because it's the difference between a show you binge and forget and a show you binge and then think about on a random Tuesday while doing laundry. Now, let's talk about music again, but specifically the musical language of humiliation versus power. Humiliation scenes often use minimal music or a low, almost inaudible drone that makes you uncomfortable without knowing why. Power scenes often use crisp percussion, confident melodies, higher dynamic range. But the best shows don't make the power music too heroic, because Cyan's arc isn't superheroic. It's moral. It's emotional. The music should feel like gravity, not fireworks. If the score swells like "He is the king," it risks turning him into a fantasy object. If the score stays grounded, more like "This is what it sounds like when someone stops apologizing for existing," then it hits deeper. And sound design can also emphasize withdrawal. When Cyan withdraws protection, the world around the family might become noisier. Phones ringing, door slamming, chaos. Or the opposite, a sudden silence where there used to be reassurance. That absence can be terrifying. Again, not claiming the show does this, but this is the kind of craft I'd want to see. Now I want to talk about the ethics of exposure, because it's not a simple good. Exposing credit thieves is righteous. Yes, but public exposure can also collateral damage people. It can ignite public mobs. It can destroy reputations beyond what's deserved. It can become spectacle. So if Cyan is a great savior, the show could make an interesting point by showing him choosing precision over spectacle. He exposes those who stole his credit, not everyone who ever annoyed him. He targets the theft, not random humiliations. He corrects the narrative. He doesn't burn the world. That would show moral discipline. And moral discipline is what separates a savior from a tyrant. But if the show leans fully into destroy them all, it might still be entertaining, but it becomes morally flatter. And then the savior label starts to feel ironic rather than sincere. I'm not opposed to morally dark protagonists, by the way. I just want the story to know what it's doing. If Cyan becomes cold and punitive, I want the drama to acknowledge that transformation as a cost, not celebrate it as healing. Now, something else worth unpacking is how the drama positions humiliation as a public-private loop. Cyan's humiliation is private, in the home. His vindication is public, at the debut. That's a reversal of where shame happens. Usually, the person being humiliated is humiliated publicly, and they heal privately. Here it's inverted. He suffers privately and heals publicly. That can be satisfying, but it can also be bittersweet, because healing in public is unstable. It depends on the crowd. It depends on attention. And attention is fickle. If Cyan's new identity depends on public validation, then the story risks making him dependent on the very system that misjudged him. So, ideally, the public debut is not where he gets his worth. It's where he asserts it. There's a difference. One is begging. One is declaring. And the divorce is the proof of that. Because divorce is a private assertion. I'm leaving. I'm done. The public debut is just the world catching up. That ordering matters. If the show frames it as he becomes powerful and then divorces, it implies he needed power to leave. But the storyline says he divorces and withdraws protection, then makes his public debut. That suggests the inner boundary comes before the outer recognition. That is psychologically healthier. And it makes the arc more inspiring in a grounded way. Here's another rehook. And it's a spicy one. The most satisfying part of Cersei's regret is not her suffering. It's her clarity. Because suffering can be random. People suffer all the time and learn nothing. Clarity is rarer. Clarity is what you get when you can no longer lie to yourself. If the drama gives Cersei clarity, if it shows her finally seeing Cyan as a person and finally seeing her own cruelty as cruelty, that's way more impactful than just watching her lose comfort. Comfort loss is punishment. Clarity is transformation, even if it comes too late. And too late is where tragedy lives. Too late is where the viewer's heart catches. You can be angry at her and still feel the sting of wasted time. Now, I want to address the title's ex-husband framing because that's another interesting choice. The story could have been called Hidden Savior Husband, but it's Loser Ex-Husband. It centers the post-breakup identity. It frames him through her rejection, even in the title. That suggests the drama is really interested in the way labels persist after relationships end. Even after divorce, people still define you by what you were in that marriage. Oh, that's her ex. That's the loser. The title is basically daring the audience to carry that bias into the story and then feel embarrassed when it's overturned. And I kind of love that. It's a meta move, whether intentional or not. It forces you to confront how quickly you accept a label. You see Loser Ex-Husband, and you already picture a certain kind of man. Then the Great Savior reveal slaps you for your assumptions. And that's smart storytelling, because it uses the audience's prejudice as part of the experience. Now, a note on cinematography again. I'd love to see the show visually emphasize the live-in aspect of his husband role. Like, he's physically in the house, but never fully integrated. Maybe he's framed through reflections, mirrors, glass, like he's present, but not. Maybe he's frequently seen in doorways, thresholds, liminal spaces. Those are visual metaphors for someone who belongs and doesn't belong at the same time. And then, at the public debut, he is no longer framed through glass. He is direct. He is centered. No more liminal space. He's fully in the room. That kind of visual storytelling is subtle but powerful. And editing can support it too. Early scenes might cut away from him quickly, like the world doesn't linger on him. Later scenes might linger, forcing everyone to look. Okay, let's get into the emotional mechanics of withdrawing all protection, because it's the pivot that makes the whole story morally satisfying. Protection is often unseen. When you withdraw it, you're not doing something new, you're stopping something old. That makes it morally cleaner. It also makes it psychologically harder, Because caretakers are addicted to caretaking. It's identity. It's purpose. It's control disguised as kindness. So when Cyan withdraws, it should feel like detox. Even if the story doesn't explicitly show it, the emotional undertone should be there. The urge to step in, to fix, to shield. The urge to prevent disaster, even for people who don't deserve his help. If Cyan is truly a savior-type personality, that urge will be strong. And resisting it will be painful. That pain is what makes him heroic in a real way. Because the most heroic thing a caretaker can do sometimes is stop enabling. Now, I want to talk about a potential late-game emotional beat that the storyline implies but doesn't confirm. What happens when the wrongdoers try to rewrite the past once he's revealed? Because that's what people do. When exposed, they often scramble not just to apologize, but to reframe. We always supported you. We didn't mean it. You misunderstood. We were testing you. The ego will do anything to avoid admitting cruelty. If the drama includes any version of that behavior, it's going to feel painfully real. And it will also make Cyan's response crucial. Does he argue with their rewriting? Does he stay calm and refuse to engage? Does he present facts and let them drown? Does he show compassion? Does he show contempt? His response tells you what kind of man he is after the divorce. It tells you whether he's healed, hardened, or still in the middle. And this is where I want to protect the story from becoming too simplistic. Because if Cyan responds with pure cruelty, it might feel satisfying, but it also risks making him less relatable. Not because anger is bad, anger is deserved, but because cruelty as identity is not inspiring. It's just a different kind of emptiness. But if he responds with calm clarity, if he refuses to let them rewrite the past and refuses to let them pull him back into emotional bargaining, that's powerful. It's also, frankly, aspirational. A lot of us wish we could do that in real life. Here's another rehook, and it's one I think is going to make you watch differently. The real villain of this story might not be Cersei. It might be the system that taught everyone in that house to confuse love with utility. Because humiliation doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in environments that reward it. It happens where empathy is seen as weakness and status is seen as morality. If the drama is bold, it uses Cersei and her family as a microcosm. It shows how a hidden savior can exist in plain sight and still be treated like trash because the environment cannot recognize value unless it's branded. That's why credit theft is such a perfect plot engine here. It's literally the system misassigning value. Now, I want to dig into Cyan's name for a second. Not because I'm going to read symbolism into it like an English teacher, but because names in dramas like this often carry a vibe. Cyan sounds clean, sharp, almost biblical. It evokes Zion for some people, which has connotations of promised land, destiny, chosenness. Again, I'm not saying the drama intends that, but the name has a weight. It sounds like someone who is meant to carry something. And that fits. He carries a promise. He carries protection. He carries hidden credit. He carries humiliation. The question is whether he ever gets to put it down. Now, what about the audience experience? If you're watching this as a newcomer, the first stretch might frustrate you. You might want to reach through the screen and shake Cyan. You might hate Cersei immediately. You might feel impatient for the reveal. And that impatience is actually part of the design. These stories feed on delayed gratification. They make you live in the unfairness, so the fairness hits harder. But there's a difference between effective unfairness and repetitive unfairness. Effective unfairness escalates meaningfully. Repetitive unfairness is just the same humiliation beat over and over with a different prop. So if you're watching and you start feeling numb rather than angry, that's a sign the show might be leaning on humiliation too hard without developing the emotional consequences. On the flip side, if you find yourself getting more and more tense, more protective of Cyan, more eager for him to stand up, that means the show is doing its job. Now, one thing I really want to see in a drama like this, and again, I'm not claiming it happens, is a moment where Cyan is offered an easy way out that would break the promise, and he refuses. Not because he's saintly, but because he's stubborn, because he's committed, because he's trying to prove something to himself. Those moments depain character. They show that he's not just stuck, he's choosing. And then, when Cersei casts him out, it's not just rejection. It's also relief, maybe. Because the promise no longer has a stage. It's like being fired from a job you hated but felt obligated to stay in. You're devastated. You're humiliated. And you're also, secretly, breathing for the first time. That emotional contradiction is delicious. Let's talk about how the drama might use wardrobe and styling to communicate Cyan's arc, because that's another subtle tool. In the humiliated live-in husband phase, he might be dressed plainly, neutrally, like someone blending into the environment. In the public debut, he might be styled more sharply. But the key is, the styling shouldn't feel like a new character. It should feel like the same person finally allowed to occupy space. For Cersei, coldness is often signaled through crisp styling, clean lines, controlled palettes. If her regret is bitter, wardrobe might soften, or it might stay rigid as a sign she's still clinging to control. Either choice can work. It depends on whether the drama wants to show transformation or entrenchment. And cinematography can mirror that. Softening lenses, changing lighting, shifting color temperature. Again, all craft choices that can make a simple premise feel rich. Now I'm going to be slightly petty for a second, but in a loving way. I hope the drama doesn't overdo the everyone claps for Cyan fantasy. I get it. It's fun. But too much public applause can make the story feel like it's pandering rather than storytelling. The most satisfying audience reaction in a public debut isn't always applause. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's people looking away because they're ashamed. Sometimes it's the wrongdoers trying to smile like nothing's happening while their world collapses internally. Silence can be more powerful than cheering. Cheering can make it feel like a performance. Silence makes it feel like a reckoning. And because the storyline ends in bitter regret, I think silence would match the tone better. Here's another rehook that gets to the heart of why this premise works. Humiliation is a form of social control, and Cyan's reveal is a form of social liberation. The humiliation keeps him in a role. It keeps him manageable. It keeps him grateful for scraps. The reveal breaks the control. It reassigns shame from him to them. And that reassignment is what the audience craves. Not because we love cruelty, but because we want the moral balance restored. Now, I want to challenge another obvious reading, gently. It's very easy to watch a story like this and think Cersei's family regrets it because they lost protection. That's probably part of it. But I think the deeper, more painful regret is the loss of certainty. When you treat someone as a loser, you build certainty around your own superiority. You feel safe because the hierarchy is clear. You know where you stand. You know who matters. Then Cyan is revealed as the great savior, and suddenly the hierarchy was a lie. That's destabilizing. It's existentially humiliating. It forces you to reconsider not just one relationship, but your entire worldview. That's why bitter regret can be so intense. It's not just missing benefits. It's mourning the collapse of a self-image. And that's actually more interesting than simple greed. It's psychological. Now, if the drama gives even a hint of that, if it shows the family grappling with the shame of being wrong, not just the inconvenience of losing protection, it becomes richer. I also want to talk about the concept of credit as a theme beyond work. Credit in relationships looks like gratitude. Credit looks like acknowledging someone's emotional labor. Credit looks like, I see you. When Cersei humiliates Cyan, she's denying him relational credit. When others steal his credit, they're denying him social credit. It's the same sin in different arenas. Erasure. So when Cyan exposes the thieves, he's not just reclaiming professional recognition. He's reclaiming the right to be acknowledged. That's why the reveal can feel like emotional justice, not just plot. Now, let's touch on the pacing of regret, Because bitter regret implies it isn't instantaneous. Regret usually comes in waves. First, denial, then anger, then bargaining, then sadness, then acceptance. Not always in that order, often looping. In dramas, regret is sometimes written as a single scene where the wrongdoer cries. That's not bitter. That's cathartic. Bitter regret is when you can't cry because your pride won't let you. But you also can't sleep because the truth won't leave you alone. So if the show portrays regret as insomnia, as irritability, as sudden quiet, as an inability to enjoy things that used to be satisfying, that's bitter. That's real. And it's also where acting can shine. A good actor can convey regret with a single glance at an empty chair. Now, a quick on-camera style aside, I know some of you watch these dramas with your finger on the fast-forward button during the humiliation arc. I see you. I understand you. No judgment. But also, sometimes the humiliation arc contains the best character groundwork, and you miss the emotional payoff if you skip too much. I'm just saying, watch responsibly. Back to Cyan. The storyline calls him a hidden savior. Savior is a loaded word. Savior implies he's not just capable, he's morally oriented toward rescue. That can be beautiful. It can also be unhealthy. Savior complexes are real. People who see themselves as saviors sometimes tolerate abuse because it validates their identity. I'm the one who endures. I'm the one who protects. They feel needed. They feel righteous. And then when they stop being needed, they feel empty. So the drama has an opportunity to explore the dark side of saviorhood. Not to villainize Cyan, but to humanize him. To show that being a savior can be a form of self-harm when it's not paired with self-respect. If Cyan withdraws all protection after being cast out, that might be the first time he chooses himself over the savior identity. And that's huge. It also sets him up for a different kind of heroism, not rescuing others, but rescuing himself. Here's a rehook that frames it in a way I find really satisfying. The public debut is not Cyan becoming the great savior. It's the world finally being forced to admit he always was. That's the emotional punch. Because it means the humiliation was never deserved. It was always ignorance and entitlement. Now, let's talk about the drama's tone, because tone is everything with a title like this. If the show leans too camp, it becomes a meme. If it leans too grim, it becomes exhausting. The best tone is probably somewhere in the middle. Heightened, but emotionally sincere. And you can achieve that through performance and direction. Let the situations be dramatic, but let the emotions be human. Don't wink at the camera too much. Don't treat humiliation as slapstick. Don't treat revenge as cartoon. If the show respects the emotional stakes, the audience will go with it, even if the premise is melodramatic. Now, I want to pull the lens back and talk about why this kind of story is so popular right now, because it's not random. The hidden competence narrative is a response to a world where people feel unseen. A lot of viewers feel like they're doing the work while someone else gets the credit. They feel like they're being judged by appearances. They feel like loyalty is exploited. So a drama where the hidden savior is finally recognized is comforting. It's a fantasy of fairness. It's also a fantasy of control. You can endure quietly because you know you'll have the last word. But here's the uncomfortable truth. In real life, you don't always get the last word. So part of the appeal is living in a world where you do. That's why I'm so insistent on emotional grounding. Because if the show is just a fairness fantasy, it can feel empty after the binge. But if it's a fairness fantasy that also acknowledges the pain of invisibility, it can feel like a balm. Now, I want to highlight one more craft element: the use of contrast in dialogue. Early in the story, Cyan's dialogue might be minimal, polite, deferential. Ceci's might be decisive, dismissive. Later, after divorce, Cyan's dialogue might become more direct, more precise. Not more verbose, more precise. Precision is power. And for Cersei, regret might show up as hesitation in her speech. Words that used to come easily now catch. That's a subtle but powerful performance cue. Again, not claiming specifics, just describing what would make the arc sing. Now, there's a potential pitfall with exposing those who stole his credit. The drama might rely on the exposure as a one-time spectacle, and then struggle with what comes after. Because once the truth is out, what's the engine? The storyline gives us a clear endpoint of regret, but it doesn't tell us what happens after that regret sets in. That's where a lot of dramas either find depth or fizzle. So the drama's sound design should honor that. It should let silence be heavy when it needs to be. It should not fill every emotional gap with music, telling you what to feel. It should let the viewer sit in discomfort sometimes. Because humiliation is uncomfortable. Regret is uncomfortable. Truth is uncomfortable. If the show constantly cushions discomfort with melodramatic scoring, it cheapens the emotions. The best sound design in a story like this is restraint. Let the viewer hear the room. Let the viewer hear the breath. Let the viewer hear the absence. Now, one thing I want to praise, at least in concept, is the idea that Cyan's public debut comes after he withdraws protection. That means the story doesn't rely on public validation to spark his boundary. He sets the boundary first. Then the public sees him. That's important because it frames his autonomy as internal rather than dependent on applause. It's the difference between I left because I'm powerful now and I left because I'm done and my power is simply now visible. That's healthier. That's more emotionally satisfying. And it also makes the titles Loser Ex-Husband label more obviously absurd because it shows the label was never accurate even when he was hidden. Here's a rehook that I think is the thing you'll remember if the drama is truly good. The moment Cyan stops protecting them is the moment he starts protecting his future self. That's what boundaries are. They're not punishments. They're investments. And that's why this story, underneath the revenge, is actually about self-respect. Now, I'm going to talk about potential weak points because even with a strong premise, execution matters. The biggest weak point in stories like this is repetition. The second biggest weak point is melodramatic overstatement. Repetition looks like humiliation scenes that don't add new information. It looks like the family being cruel in the same way over and over. It looks like the protagonist being silent in the same way over and over. That can numb the viewer. Overstatement looks like dialogue that spells out emotions too directly. You humiliated me for 3 years. You are nothing. I will make you regret it. It can turn a grounded story into a soap. Now, soaps can be fun. But given the storyline's emphasis on promise and bitter regret, I think this story wants to be taken seriously. So it needs to earn seriousness through nuance. And nuance is especially important for Cyan. He's at risk of being written as too perfect. Hidden savior protagonists often become moral statues. They endure without complaint. They reveal without flaw. They punish without cruelty. They never make mistakes. That's boring. The more compelling version is Cyan making hard choices, sometimes messy ones. Feeling anger, feeling grief, feeling guilt, wrestling with the promise, wrestling with the habit of protection, struggling to detach, struggling not to become cold. Those struggles are what make him relatable. Now, let's talk about the emotional impact of the divorce again, but from the angle of what divorce symbolizes in a culture that often treats marriage as status. If Cersei's family is status-obsessed, divorce might not just be heartbreak. It might be shame. It might be scandal. It might be a threat to their image. So when Cyan divorces her, he's not just leaving a relationship. He's disrupting their social narrative. He's telling the world, this marriage was not what you thought. This family is not what you thought. And that makes the public debut even more potent, because now he's not just an ex-husband. He's an ex-husband who refused to be erased. That's why ex-husband is such a charged identity. It implies history. It implies intimacy that ended. It implies secrets. It implies that the person being dismissed has seen behind the curtain. So when Sayan appears publicly and exposes credit theft, he's not a random outsider calling out wrongdoing. He's someone who lived in the house. He knows the rot intimately. That makes his truth harder to dismiss. Here's a rehook that leans into the emotional punch. Cersei didn't just cast him out. She cast out the person who was keeping her world stable. That's why the regret is bitter. Because it's not just losing him. It's realizing she misjudged the foundation. Now, I'm going to address one more audience dynamic. Sometimes viewers project their own relationships onto stories like this. If you've been treated as expendable, you might latch onto Sayan as a stand-in for your own desire to be recognized. If you've ever been the one who was cold and later regretted it, you might find Cersei unsettling because she's a mirror you don't want to look at. That's part of why this kind of story gets people heated. It's not just fiction. It touches real wounds. And because it touches real wounds, I think the drama has a responsibility not to romanticize humiliation as endurance. The promise should not be framed as beautiful because he suffered. It should be framed as tragic because he believed he had to. Now, I want to bring back the idea of promise one last time in a way that ties everything together. A promise is a contract with the past. It's you deciding that something you said before will govern what you do now. That can be honorable. It can also trap you in a version of yourself you've outgrown. So when Sayan finally divorces and withdraws protection, he's renegotiating his relationship with the past. He's saying, my past self made a vow, but my present self deserves to live. That's growth. And the public debut is the external manifestation of that growth. He is no longer living for the past's promise. He is living for the present's truth. That's why this premise, simple as it looks, can actually carry a lot. Here's a rehook that sets up my eventual verdict, but I'm not closing yet. If you come to this drama for revenge, you'll get it. But the real reason it works is that it understands revenge is hollow without self-respect. Now, I want to talk about the emotional aesthetics of regret. Bitter regret is not cinematic in the obvious way. It's not a scream. It's not a tearful collapse. It's the dull ache that makes people pick fights over nothing. It's the quiet staring into space. It's the inability to enjoy what used to feel luxurious. So if the drama portrays bitter regret as small and persistent rather than loud and dramatic, it will feel more adult. And yes, adult is the word. This premise is melodramatic, but the emotions can be adult. Similarly, Sayan's victory should ideally not be portrayed as childish gloating. It should be portrayed as relief, as calm, as control returned to its rightful honor. Now, because we're on Flick Flare, and I know you're here for my actual stance, let's start easing into how I feel about the story overall, based on what we can confirm and what the premise promises. The premise is strong. It's clean. It's emotionally charged. It's got a built-in arc that satisfies, humiliation to boundary, erasure to recognition, theft to exposure, entitlement to regret. Where it will live or die is in its nuance. In whether it makes Sayan human rather than a statue. In whether it makes Cersei psychologically believable rather than cartoon evil. In whether it treats humiliation as tragic rather than entertaining. In whether it treats exposure as correction rather than cruelty. If it hits those notes, it's not just bingeable. It's cathartic. If it misses those notes, it becomes genre mush, satisfying in flashes, hollow in the in-between. Here's a rehook that goes straight to what I think is the drama's most powerful potential message. You don't have to be powerful to deserve respect, but you do have to stop negotiating with contempt. That's what Sayan learns. That's what the family learns too late. That's what makes the regret bitter rather than redemptive. Now, I'm going to offer a viewer-oriented reading of Sayan's public debut, because it's the emotional centerpiece of the storyline's second half. When Sayan debuts publicly, the viewers are not just watching characters react. We're watching a social correction. We're watching the reallocation of credit. And that is deeply satisfying in a world where credit is often misallocated. So the debut functions like a fantasy of fairness. And there's nothing wrong with that. Stories are allowed to give us what reality doesn't. But the drama becomes truly memorable if it acknowledges that fairness doesn't erase the past. It only prevents future erasure. And that's why, for me, the best ending flavor is not everyone regrets. It's Cyan is free. Bitter regret is their punishment. Freedom is his reward. Now, let's talk about who this drama is for, because that matters more than whether it's good in some abstract sense. If you love stories about underestimated protagonists reclaiming recognition, this is your lane. If you love a clean reversal where the people who dismissed the lead are forced to confront their own arrogance, you're going to eat this up. If you love truth as weapon storytelling, exposure, credit reclaimed, public reality shift, you'll find it satisfying. If you cannot stand extended humiliation arcs, proceed carefully. This story's entire engine is he endured humiliation for 3 years. That means the emotional tone is heavy in the early stretch, even if the payoff later is sweet. If humiliation is a personal trigger for you, you might want to pace it. Or you might want to skip this entirely and protect your peace. No shame in that. If you're someone who needs romance to be tender and mutual, this might frustrate you, because the central relationship is defined by cold casting out and regret rather than softness. This is not cozy love. This is love as a battleground of recognition. And if you're someone who likes morally grey protagonists who get a little too ruthless, you might or might not be satisfied depending on how the drama frames Cyan's withdrawal and exposure. The storyline suggests a more morally disciplined arc, which I personally prefer. But if you're here for maximal chaos, you might want something more unhinged. Now, my verdict, and I'm going to keep it honest and grounded. The loser ex-husband is the great savior, has the kind of premise that practically prints dopamine. But what makes it worth your time is the moral architecture under the revenge. The promise. The choice to withdraw protection instead of just destroy. The focus on stolen credit, which makes the payoff feel like authorship being reclaimed, not just ego being fed. The regret being bitter rather than neat is also, for me, a mark of emotional maturity in the concept. I come out of it feeling like, if you let yourself sink into the discomfort early on, the later reversal can actually feel cleansing rather than just loud. Not because it erases what happened, but because it insists that what happened mattered, and that it demands a correction. If you're looking for a drama that gives you that finally feeling, the finally of truth, the finally of boundaries, the finally of consequences, this is absolutely worth putting on your list. If you're looking for something light, romantic, and soft, or if humiliation arcs make you feel sick rather than invested, I'd skip it and choose something that doesn't ask your nervous system to do that work. And if you watched it, I want to know what hit you harder. The cold casting out, the divorce boundary, or the public debut exposure. Drop your read in the comments. And if you want more long-form breakdowns like this on Flick Flare, you can subscribe. Same as always, no pressure. But I'll be here either way, watching the masks come off and trying to figure out why it always feels so good when the truth finally gets the mic.